So I made this video a while ago and I had a few requests on how to create it. So I made a tutorial showing you how to create the curves, how to animate the lighting so it turns on and off, and then how to create the glow in the compositor. So to create this effect, I've just created a text object and we're going to use this as a template to build our curves around, because all the glowing pipes are actually individual curves that then have a bevel object applied to them. Now you can just convert this mesh into a curve to create some of the curves for your glowing objects. So if you only wanted the outline, which is what these curves provide, this would be enough. But for the one that I made, I had lots of individual curves and I wanted them all to glow at different times. So I'm actually going to still use this as a template, just to say you can use that method, but I'm going to show you how to build the curves from scratch. So I've just gone onto the object panel and I'm going to set the display mode to wire. I'm then going to click this little cursor icon on the object so I can't select it, and also hide it from the render by clicking the camera icon. So I'll go into front view and then I'm just going to Shift A, add curve Bezier, and then go into edit mode, and I'm just going to start positioning the handles for where I think they should be. So I'm just using basic controls and you can see down here which buttons I'm pressing. So I'm just going to scale this down and then extrude it. And we're just using that original object as a template, and I'll probably just speed this up so you don't have to sit through it. And sometimes if you want to just straighten up a handle, I'm just going to press S, X and 0 and it just flattens it out. Now we've built most of it, and I spoke earlier about a bevel object, and that's what gives the pipes a cylindrical look. So I'm just going to place the cursor over here by right clicking, Shift A and then curve circle. And I know roughly how big I want this to be. And that should be the right size. So I'm going to go over to the object panel, copy its name, select our curve, and then in the curve options I'm going to set the bevel object to be that small circle we just made by just pasting the name in with Ctrl V. And you can see it's just applied it to the curve. So what I'm going to do now is just move this handle over, and then if you press Alt C you can close the curve, and then you can just do some final tweaks. And if you want to add in a few extra points, you just select 2, W and then subdivide, and that'll just straighten out that middle area. And so there we have a basic pipe. If I just go into top view and move that to the front by G and then Y, because this is the front part of the mesh, I can now add the actual material that we're going to animate, because it's the emit value of the material that is going to create that glow effect, and it's going to illuminate the other objects when we enable indirect lighting. So I'm just going to change the color to about that, a nice luminous green. And then, like I said, it's the emit value we're going to change, and if I just put that up to 1 for a second, you see everything's got brighter, and this is what's going to control the brightness. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of my timeline. On frame 1, I'm just going to press I over the emit value, and it's gone yellow, showing there's a keyframe on that value. And what we're going to do is apply a few modifiers to the actual animation curve to create the random effect. So if I just split the view out by left clicking on the little corner, then changing this view to the graph editor, and then expanding the channels to select our emit value, and you can see this line, this pink line, is the value, and it's staying at 0 throughout the animation. And here we have the modifiers panel, and we're going to add a noise modifier, and this is how we get the random effect. But what I want is the glow to be on and then off and then on and then off. I don't want it to go in between. If you just look at this value here while I scrub through the timeline, it's going at lots of values that aren't exactly 0 and not on exactly 1. They're going all in between. Well, the first thing we can do to make sure it doesn't go below or above the values, which are 0 and 1, I'm going to add another modifier, which is the limits modifier. And if I just expand this out, you can see this says minimum y and maximum y. And because we want to limit it on the y-axis, which is up inside the graph editor, the minimum can stay at 0, but the maximum I want to be 1, because that's the maximum value for the emit value I want. So I'll set that. If I just zoom in and turn this on and off by pressing this little speaker icon, which means mute, you can see it's clipping the values. And because the values aren't high enough at 1, it isn't clipping them. And to change that, I'm firstly going to change the scale of the noise, because if you scrub through it at the minute, it's changing every couple of frames. I don't want it to change quite so much, so I'm going to change this to 4. If I zoom out, the value changes far less. Now, to get the value to go from 0 to 1 immediately, we use the strength value. And if I just drag this value up, you can see that the values are being clipped to 1, and that's because of our limits. And if I turn that off, you can see this is what it would look like when it wasn't clipped. You'll also see that if I just hide this a bit, we're still getting values that aren't quite fully at 1 or fully at 0. So I'm just going to ramp this up to something stupid like 4,000. And this should mean that all values are reaching their maximum, which I want them to be, which are 1 or 0. And if I go through now, go 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and if you look at this here, if I press Alt-A to play, you can see it's turning on and off, just as we want. But what I want is the light to be off at the beginning, to go on and off in the middle, and then to stay on, because that's what the light is doing. It's turning on, but it's flickering while it's doing it. So the first thing to do is to set the limit of where we want the noise to begin and end. And I want the noise to stop at frame 100. So if you just turn on restrict frame range by pressing this, you'll see it completely disappears because the start is 0 and the end is 0. We want it to start at 0, but I'm going to end it at 100. And you can see it's being clipped. The second problem is that it's off, it goes on and off, and then it stays off. But we want it so that when the noise ends, it's on. And this requires a second keyframe. So I'm just going to move into the middle somewhere. And it just so happens that this frame is already set to 1. If it wasn't, you just click it, change it to 1, and we're going to press I. And you'll see I've got an error because it's saying you can't add keyframes when you've got modifiers applied. So I'll just disable these quickly. Press I again. We've got a keyframe, but now we've got a slope on it. So I'll just go back a frame and set this one to 0 and press I. So now within one frame it changes its value. And if I put the modifiers back on, you can see it starts as off, goes on and off, and ends on. And so what it's doing, when the noise ends, it's just reverting to the default keyframes. And because we changed them in the middle, it just transitions seamlessly. So if I press Alt-A in the 3D view, you can see it starts going on and off, and then at frame 100, it'll stay on, and that'll be the end. So now, I have another object, which I want to do the same thing to, but the thing we have to do is create an individual material for each of the objects. If they all are the same material, then they would all turn off and on at the same time, and because that's not the effect I want, it has to have an individual one. So this is called material. I'll just select it, type in material, and you can see it says 2 because both this and this are using it, so it's got 2 users. I'll click it to make it a single user, so now these materials are separated from each other, but they are copies, and you'll see that it has inherited the keyframes we put on, so we don't have to apply them again, as they're in the timeline when we select this object and when we select this object. But if I play it back again, they're both turning on and off at the same time. Now I said we were creating separate materials to avoid this, but so far we haven't, and that's because we need to change the random value for the noise. At the minute, they're both getting the same noise, so what we can do is change the phase value. And this basically says to generate a different set of random numbers. So as I was building my animation and applying these effects, I would simply increase the phase number by 1, so this will become 2. And now you can see we're getting a different noise value. If I play it back, you can see they're both doing different things. Now, what you may want to do is actually play around with the start and end frames. On mine, I actually had completely different start and end frames on all of the objects, as I only wanted one object to start the animation, and then the rest would turn on after that. And they would also end at different times. So really it's just playing around with these values. All you have to be careful about is that you don't set the end range for the noise to be less than the position of the middle keyframe. So our middle keyframes are set around 50, so you shouldn't really have the end around there, unless you want to play around and move all the keyframes, but that can be a bit time consuming. So I'm just going to close the view by left clicking and dragging over. And I have some other objects that I prepared earlier. You can see that they all have the same effect. Now I also have some other objects, and this object is basically just an extruded plane, and this is because these neon tubes are going to actually cast light, so they need something to cast light onto. So if we go to a frame where the neon is lit up, like there, if we render, we get this, which is all very nice, and you can see that some parts are lit up and some aren't, but it's not actually casting lights onto the other objects, and they aren't illuminating anything. And that's because whenever you use the emit value and you want it to illuminate something, then you have to enable indirect lighting in the world panel. So I'm just going to enable indirect lighting, and you can see it only works with approximate gather, so you'll change it to approximate and re-render, and you can see the objects are now casting a nice light onto the plane below it, and they're also illuminating the objects that aren't actually lit. And really that is all you have to do. One final effect I'm going to show you is how to add a slight glow to the text, and that's done with the compositor. Over to the render panel, turn on compositing in the post-processing panel. We're then going to go over to the node editor, make sure we're on compositing, use nodes and backdrop, and I'll add an output viewer and link them up just by dragging. And then I'm going to add a filter blur, and I'll link that up to the output as well so we can see what's happening. And I'll set that to, first I'll set it to Gaussian, which just gives a nicer blur, and set this to 10 and 10. Add a color mix node and link that up, and because it's mixing it with nothing, it's changed to white. And we're going to mix it with the original unblurred node, set it to 0.5, and then the blur is a bit too much, so I'll reduce that to 5 and 5, and you can see we're getting a bit of a blur around the edge. And for one added thing, I'll just move these out of the way, we can add a hue and saturation, and I like to just reduce the saturation of the original object so that the glow has a slightly different colour to the object, and it just gives a bit of the impression that the light has more intensity on the actual tubes and the glow is less intense. So that basically is it. I hope you've learnt something. It's quite useful knowing about the noise and the limits modifiers. If you have any other suggestions about either how I can make these tutorials better or any ideas for tutorials really, please let me know in the comments, and I'll hopefully see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.